Welcome everyone for episode 2 of Retire with Style with Wade and Alex. I'm Alex, and I'm here with Wade.
Hi, everyone.
And today we want to talk about why retirement is different. Wade, you want to kick it off?
Yeah, it's an important detail. It's really what makes retirement income planning is something distinct from traditional managing investment portfolios and trying to grow assets for retirement. The nature of the problem changes when you shift from saving for retirement to trying to spend from your assets in retirement. And that's really what we want to focus on today.
Yeah, and I hope everyone enjoyed yesterday's, not yesterday, our first inaugural episode.
Got to be more evergreen, Alex.
yeah, right? Well, hey,
it's 1 week later.
we're learning as we're growing here. But yeah, it was kind of an interesting thing for us. We're excited to bring this one to you. And one of the reasons we want to talk about this with regards to what Wade was saying is a lot of times you can make the argument, why not 100% in equities? Listen, I'm retiring. I'm 65. I've got till 95. Why not just put it 100% in equities because I got time diversification on my side? How would you answer something like that, Wade?
Well, as a starting point, maybe that's okay for some people, but it's definitely not for everyone. And it's the case is maybe if even that was right pre-retirement, it may be different post-retirement. And that's because you don't get to benefit from the idea of a long-term time horizon in the same way when you're spending from assets. There's this idea of sequence of returns risk. If you're spending from a portfolio, a dip in the market, rather than providing a buying opportunity, it's kind of the reverse of that. You now have to sell more shares to meet your spending obligations. And those assets leave your portfolio. And then hopefully, even as the overall market recovers, the problem is your portfolio doesn't get to recover in the same way because there's less left. You start to dig a hole for yourself where you don't always get to benefit from, say, the next 30 years, the average market return is quite high. It's really what happens in those early retirement years that's going to matter the most.
I think, too, Wade, there's another concept that I know you've written about and I've seen elsewhere. And it strikes home for me because you're right. I mean, why not 100% in equities? There's sequence risk, and we can really unpack that one in a little bit. But the idea that, okay, you have a portfolio and you're in your mid-30s and, you know, let's say it's 250 grand or something like that, and you have a 30% market hit, you're still accumulating assets. You still have human capital that you can draw on for your everyday living. And so, frankly, it benefits you, the volatility. You're putting it away, and it grows, right? But effectively, as the value gets larger and larger, obviously the percentile drop is the same, but nominally, it's a far greater number from that standpoint. You want to talk about that concept? Because I've always thought, I'm thinking of risk like that as a hurricane map, if you will. Mm-hmm. That the more years behind the portfolio, that nominal drop, takes a bite, if you will.
Yeah, there's this old question, are you a stock or a bond? And that's about like your earnings over your lifetime. For most people, their lifetime earnings, like from working, are going to behave more like a bond. It's not as volatile as the stock market. And so when you're young, usually your human capital, which is all your future earnings that you have yet to realize, but they're waiting for you in the future, that is a significant asset. And compared to the size of your investment portfolio, it just completely dwarfs the investment portfolio. And then as you go through life and earn salary over time, you're making this shift from, I have less human capital in the future, and if I'm saving part of my assets, more of my assets are now in this financial portfolio. And so when we think about if whatever my stock allocation is, not just of the investment portfolio, but of all the assets that you have over time with a fixed stock allocation in your investment portfolio, it's going to be an increasing percentage of your overall asset base just because that human capital is decreasing over time. And that's, again, for most people, it's more like a bond. And so if you count it as a bond, you've got an increasing stock allocation. So that's where target date funds and all the other sort of discussion about retirement is. When you're young, when you're still 30 or 40 years away from retirement, you can use a higher stock allocation. As you get closer to retirement, you tend to cut back on the stock allocation. And there's really the two competing explanations for that. I gave the sequence of returns risk argument first, but also this human capital story. It leads to the same conclusion. It's you have a lower stock allocation as a percentage of your investments when you get closer to retirement.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think that's very, very important. I think we get caught up in platitudes as we read or even as we're talking to clients sometimes with, don't worry, just, leave it alone and don't touch it, and I get it, and that's the right advice, frankly, but I think the nuance there is the human capital component. I mean, and I have, Wade, your kids are in school, my kids are in school, and what they're doing with their education, to say this point in another way, is they're investing in their human capital. They're making themselves employable. So when they're in their professional years, they can mine from that resource and use it to pay down their everyday bills and et cetera, and frankly, invest the surplus. But what you're doing, the present value of all your future earnings is immense. That's where the majority of your wealth, on average, comes from it. And I don't think folks recognize that if you really take a step back. I think there's clips of Warren Buffett talking to students, and they're asking him about investments, and his advice to them is effectively invest in your human capital. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, invest in your human capital because that's the largest asset that you have. But as you're retiring now, and this goes back to why not 100% in equities, as you're retiring, there's less and less dependence on that human capital. You're mining effectively that human capital. Hopefully, you've transitioned the surplus into investments that have grown over the long term. But when you hit that retirement age, effectively, you become less employable. Your human capital, you've mined what you're going to mine from. So if there's a market downturn, you can't draw on now human capital to continue. And you hear this all the time. To some extent, as you enter retirement, a lot of folks are forced into retirement, even at that stage. So you can't rest on that anymore. So the reality is now it's all coming from a portfolio, and you throw in extra risk that we'll talk about in a moment. It becomes very difficult, the argument of why not 100% in equities for a certain subset of folks to see that as a viable solution. Even though, yes, over the next 30 years, on average, time diversification will play out. If you look at the rolling returns over 5-year, 10-year, 15, 20-year periods, why not? That's fine and dandy, but the reality is that you're no longer mining human capital. It's all coming from your investment portfolio, and there's new risks that you face now that you didn't face while you were accumulating. And, Wade, I think it'd be good to sort of, now that we've level set that, to really talk about some of these new risks that folks face in retirement.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to just emphasize the point you made as well, sometimes it's said that retirement is the riskiest day of your life. And what's meant by that is it's, as you said, once you retire, to the extent that before retiring, maybe you could continue working longer, but after you retire, it becomes much harder to find an equivalent job or to have the same kind of income again with part-time work or whatever the case may be. And so there's a significant drop to your human capital on the day you retire, just because now your prospective future earnings decrease just to the extent that it's hard to return to the labor force again. And so you have to be prepared for that. And that's step one. And then the other risk retirees face, well, it's this whole market issue that we discussed a little bit with the sequence of returns. It's the longevity risk. I think we should spend some time talking about that, because that's really the overarching risk of retirement. The idea of ending up, you live so long that you outlive your assets. And then there's all the different spending shocks that can impact retirees in terms of just, you've made your budget, you know how much you want to spend on a year-by-year basis, but then unexpected things happen that require you to either spend more than you anticipated or that maybe pull from your assets in ways that you had not anticipated. And you need to think about how you're going to manage that type of spending shock risk as well.
And wait, there's a couple of concepts with regards to longevity that I think play into this. And Moshe Milevsky, if you haven't read up on him, you should. He's very prolific, and he's spot on pretty much everything that, at least from my vantage point, that he writes about. But there's a term called longevity risk aversion. And I think that's a guiding factor for a lot of folks. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's really the term of how fearful are you about outliving your assets or of having to make substantial cuts to your standard of living late in life. And so he calls it longevity risk aversion. And it's really the heart of retirement in terms of, are you someone who's not longevity risk averse? Like, it's more you want to front load, you want to enjoy the early retirement years as much as possible. You know you're healthy, you know you're still alive, and so forth. And if the situation happens where you are 95 years old, you don't mind living on less at that point, just because it may never happen. And if it does, I want to just make sure I can enjoy these years. That would be someone who's not longevity risk averse. The longevity risk averse person is much more focused on, no, I can't imagine being in a situation where I have to substantially live on much less late in life. So I'm willing to sacrifice more today to better protect my future self and to ensure a more stable standard of living, no matter how long I might live in my retirement.
Yeah, and so it's a risk because you don't know how long you're going to live, right? Endowment funds, insurance companies, they can pool everyone's mortality and get an average and manage their finances like that, whereas an individual, you don't know what that number is. Even though life expectancy could be at 92, consider that half of the people in that range will live beyond 92, half will live, below that. So it's, there's good news and bad news kind of to either side of those stories if you're not planning it properly. And so, the economists of the world will say something along the lines of, you should plan to spend relative to the probabilities that you're going to be alive. Those are those statements that make a lot more sense post hoc than before the actual experience, if you will. And so, Wade alluded to earlier, and we see this a lot. Wade, this idea of front loading, from a longevity standpoint, some folks, take it to the extent that maybe they err on the side of even being a little spendthrift, where I'm going to enjoy it now. If I need to make cuts later, so be it. But from the aversion standpoint, what you see a lot of times is folks that are like, listen, I get the whole rational player spend relative to the probabilities that you're going to be alive, but the reality is that I can't enjoy it. I literally can't enjoy it because I know that there's always a chance, that Dumb and Dumber. So you're saying I got a chance. There's always a chance that, you may outlive your expectations and you may need money. And you're deathly, afraid of running out of money, but also being a burden to others. That sort of reverse legacy that I heard you say, hey, Wade, that's, kind of funny, until it happens to you. But it's kind of an interesting concept. And so you have this longevity risk. And so that's a risk that you just, it doesn't happen while you're accumulating. Accumulating is really just volatility. And if you can withstand the volatility and use time diversification on your side, there you have it. But in retirement, these are real risks that you're now facing.
To say it another way, it's suppose a 65-year-old woman these days, if she's in reasonably good health, there's about a 10% chance she'll live to 100. And so how do you view that? Because for a given individual, you're either alive at 100 or you're not. That's going to be my mother-in-law, Wade. But you're either alive at 100 or you're not. And if you are longevity risk averse, you're needing to feel more like you need to plan for the possibility that you're going to be part of that 10% that makes it to 100. And then that really just impacts how you frame a lot of the other retirement income decisions, because you have to have that planning ahead, and that means maybe not spending as much today to better ensure the ability to spend at age 100, if that's the case. If you're less longevity risk averse, you're willing to roll the dice on that and say, okay, I'm probably not going to make it to 100. And if I did, it's okay if I have to spend less at that point. Let's enjoy today as much as possible.
Okay. And Wade, in terms of sequence of return risk, and look, we're going to try to identify these new risks that you face in retirement. And the reality is some of them are additive, some of them aren't, but they're just new nuances that you need to take into consideration. And you were talking about sequence risk. And I've always liked how and sequence risk is kind of like a hot new term that folks have been throwing around, I think, for the last few years. Kind of like I read up on indexing. Okay, what else is there? Sequence risk, that kind of thing. But I've always been interested in how that plays into the fragile decade concept, and this sort of retirement risk theme that we're going with right now. I feel every decade for me is a fragile decade, but at least as far as my ego is concerned. But you wanna touch upon some of those concepts with regards to retirement income?
Sure. And that's something that I've quantified, and sequence risk is really important for retirees. But I think people are used to thinking more about, it's called a lump sum investment. Like if I put money in the market today and I left it alone for the next 60 years, it's probably going to grow. And the order of the returns doesn't matter, because if you put money in the market today and leave it alone, no matter whether the good markets come now or later or whenever they come, you'll always have the same end balance. But when you're saving for retirement and then spending in retirement, it's a different situation. Like if I'm going to save for the next 30 years, I'm at the start of my career, the market returns today don't really matter because I haven't saved much yet. But by the end of that 30 years, just before retiring, those market returns are impacting all 30 years of my savings. And so they have a much bigger impact. And so that fragile decade, it's kind of, if you define it precisely as a decade, the 5 years before retiring, the 5 years after retiring. The 5 years before you retire, market returns have a much bigger impact on what your wealth balance will be at retirement. And then when you make that switch where you're no longer saving, you're now spending from the assets. That just amplifies the importance of those first 5 years of retirement all that much more. Because if the market drops in year one of retirement, it's going to really impact what is a sustainable spending level throughout that retirement in a way that if you say had a 30-year long retirement, if the market drops in year 30, it has almost no impact. By then, you've either been able to spend quite a bit or not as much, but the year 30 of your retirement, that market return isn't really going to impact your retirement sustainability.
So just think about, for everyone listening, think about the role of chance in terms of your retirement, if it's just dependent on a portfolio here. And your allocation, because that was the initial, what are the new risks in retirement that you need to consider? It's not just looking at it saying I've got 30 years. It's, how that random draw occurs. And, you could have two people that are retiring 5 years apart, and they literally have the same exact strategy. But if you retired in 2007 versus 2012 or 13, I don't know if that's 5 or 6, it makes a world of difference. And one guy thinks they're a genius, the other person thinks, what have I done? I've made a terrible mistake, that kind of thing. And they're both following the same strategy. Mm-hmm. And so this is an interesting kind of conundrum here, right? Same strategy, different return. And what happened? They just caught the wrong end of the sequence risk.
Yeah, and that's where sometimes people think about retirement as, well, if the market crashes like some sort of economic disaster, no one can expect to have a good retirement. But the sequence risk doesn't really work that way. We don't have to talk about an economic disaster. It could just be the market's down for a few years and then recovers. So if you're just investing a lump sum, you'd be okay. It wouldn't matter. And if your retirement timing was right, it also may not have all that much impact on you. But if you retired right at the start of a several-year downturn that eventually recovers, that's where you may experience a very different outcome with your retirement than somebody who retired a couple of years before you or a couple of years after you.
And so these are these new risks. So they are, retirement is different. How so? Longevity risk you need to consider. Sequence of return risk, specifically because you're in that fragile decade where the stock market sequence that happens 5 years previous to retirement and 5 years post-retirement are going to have a disproportionate effect than the stock returns when you're in your mid-80s, if you will. Mm-hmm. Now, when you get to your mid-80s, or maybe even beforehand, you have other concerns as well that are new to retirement. And wait, I just want to talk about spending shocks. What kind of spending shocks Do you view that are relative to that you view are more salient in retirement than not? Not that you don't have spending shocks when you're accumulating, but again, you have human capital. You're working. So, if you're doing a good job with that, you have this income stream, and so you can leave your investments alone and let them accumulate. Again, retirement, you're no longer working. You don't, hence retired, right? So that human capital is depleted. So now spending shocks, all of a sudden, increases in importance. Wait, you got the baton.
Mm-hmm. And especially the like, there's many different kinds of spending shocks, and of course, any of them can happen at any point in someone's life. But some of them become a bigger risk as one ages, and that's probably the biggest spending shock retirees need to think about is just the idea of long-term care and needing to support a multi-year scenario of needing either expensive in-home care or even moving to an institution to provide a more formal, like long-term care help and assistance. And that's the issue where ultimately some people, they'd never have to pay a single dollar for long-term care expenses. But then at the other extreme, the lifetime long-term care bills for some individuals, especially with like Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia that require a long stay in a nursing home, could potentially exceed $1 million. And so that's probably the biggest spending shock risk that the retiree faces, is having to manage a long-term care event.
Yeah, I mean, so much so, Wade, that this is its own episode, if you will, or a series of episodes talking about long-term care. But this is we quantify these as concerns about reserves, right? I mean, in retirement, Wade has a concept known as the 4Ls: longevity, which we covered, and then this is sort of liquidity, where it begins to deal with reserves to some extent, and there's a difference between having set aside for. When we looked, Wade and I have looked at this in great detail, and people view reserves in two ways. They see reserves for like general reserves. My house, needs some refurbishing because hurricane came through, something like that. But they also specifically view reserves for health in a completely in its own category. So it's a quite an important topic, and Wade is spot on. I mean, this is something that it's one of these brace for impact kind of things, and to make sure that you're ready for, specifically with retirement, something that is, it's like a cousin to this, and I'm personally experiencing this with my mom, is declining cognitive abilities. From that vantage point, what are your views on that? As a spending shock, and the reason I say this, and I'll talk personally here. With my mom, effectively, she has a support system, so we can help her with regards to making decisions and things along those lines. But in terms of a risk, let's just say we weren't around or the social support wasn't in place, I don't know how she would be able to manage investments, if at all. And mostly she wouldn't, from that standpoint. And she's in her late 70s. And that's not particularly all that old relative to life expectancy. And so, cognitive decline is a real issue with regards to investment risks that you'll face in retirement. And, this affects how you decide to deploy your assets, across your balance sheet. And so it does come up, and frankly, we see this a lot with clients at our wealth management firm as well. It's one of those things that's, we like to think that we're always going to be on point and sharp and so forth. But there is a significant issue there. Now, in addition to just, my mom's is more of an Alzheimer's kind of track, but there's also just general cognitive decline. As you get older, there's crystallized intelligence and there's more fluid intelligence. And let's say crystallized intelligence would be more encyclopedia knowledge. You're good at trivia, if you will, to kind of generalize a little bit. Whereas fluid is more thinking on your feet, dealing with stressors and still coming to a conclusion. And the reality is that, I forget, I think it's in your mid-50s, as you start, going on that track, crystallized intelligence tends to baseline, but your fluid intelligence drops, in a measured manner. And so this happens. This is not one of these things where you're on some sort of track with an illness. This is just the natural process of aging. And so this is something that in retirement, it's best to prepare for before it's a problem, because it's one of those things that it's not a problem until it is. And when it is, it's almost like a too late kind of thing. And so how you deploy your assets for automaticity is very important, with regards to that. I mean, I use my mom example. She's 78. You talk about safe withdrawal rates, and if the market goes up and inflation goes down, you adjust your spending, et cetera, et cetera. That's dead in the water for someone like that. It's a non-starter. Wade?
Right, and it can manifest in different ways too. People might start making mistakes. They may forget to pay bills. They might resubscribe to the same magazine every time they get your subscription is running out notices that are usually not accurate. And so that can raise costs in a way that wasn't necessarily budgeted in advance. It could also just be needing to pay for more outsourcing of like lawn care or snow removal, or things that you may have done in the past but increasingly can't always do on your own. It may be expenses for aging in place too that you didn't necessarily anticipate, like needing to put in a bathroom or a bedroom on the first floor of the home. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, sorry, Wade, I was going to say, because it's important, in terms of intelligence, your confidence in your abilities doesn't decline as well. So it's almost like you're a little bit of a frog in hot water kind of vibe, because you're not seeing the decline happening. You're assuming you're just like you were in your 30s and 40s.
Right. Yeah. My friend Michael Finca had a really nice diagram that plots that sort of behavior, where they provided a test of financial literacy skills and saw how the scores decline with age, but the confidence in one's ability to accomplish these financial tasks did not decrease. It even slightly increased with age. So there was a big divergence there between ability and perceived ability that can lead to trouble, and can also lead to the other item I was just going to mention with this whole issue was the idea of elder fraud or elder abuse. And that's where, as those cognitive skills decline, it becomes increasingly difficult to separate who has good intentions, who does not have good intentions, and the impact that can have on one's finances.
Wait, so again, just try to recap it for everyone. So again, what are the new risks in retirement, right? Longevity, fragile decade, sequence of return, cognitive decline, spending shocks for healthcare, and spending shocks for like one-off things. You want to help your child with something, or again, something happens with your house. These are things that you don't have human capital to rely on. You're going to take it from your balance sheet, and you need to make accommodations for that to be able to accomplish that. There's also divorce. Great divorces are up, so that's another consideration that you folks need to think about. Don't mean to start a fire here in anyone's marriage, but things happen. From an economic standpoint, there are also things that they're going to be exposed to. And Wade, I know you got in your back pocket presentations on this, but if you may want to discuss a little bit inflation and changing, let's say, tax policies, and how do you think about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, inflation's a big one, and for a long time now, we were getting used to inflation being low and thinking it would stay that way. Certainly in 2021, the headlines about inflation started to pick up with, inflation may actually be a concern in the future. And that can be a spending shock. If your spending you anticipate will grow with inflation over time, and you built your financial plan around, say, assuming a 2 or 3% inflation rate, and then inflation ends up being 4 or 5%, that just means a lot of additional expenditures that weren't necessarily part of the financial plan. And so that's how it becomes a spending shock. You need to spend more than you anticipated. And how do you manage that sort of risk, or how do you manage any of these spending shocks? It's really that conversation around reserves, that you have something available outside of what you've earmarked for your budgeted goals and for your legacy goals and so forth, to be a resource for these type of unexpected situations, whether it's inflation or another one is just you mentioned, like changing public policy or changing tax laws. Every couple of years, it seems like you may have had a strategy in place and then something changes to completely rearrange how you have to approach those decisions, whether it's with Social Security, whether it's with taxes and the ability or some of the strategies around like doing Roth conversions and so forth, whether it's different tools like reverse mortgages and the rules that impact those. Things always are changing over time, and you have to be flexible to deal with that as well. And another risk that we should mention as well is the death of a spouse. And that's something that's inevitable, but the implications of that and the financial as well as other, of course, other emotional and other aspects of it. But how was the household set up in terms of, is there one spouse who manages the family finances and can the other spouse take over? If not just death of a spouse, but also incapacity of that spouse. And also things like Social Security, if there is a traditional pension, are those based on the life of one individual or based on the life of both individuals? The tax situation changes when people have to switch from married filing jointly to filing as a single individual. That can, with the death of a spouse, usually the overall household expenditures will decrease somewhat, but not like by half, because a lot of expenses are the same regardless of whether it's one or two people.
If I can jump in, I think the death of a spouse is, thank you for bringing that up. I think that's one of these things that flies under the radar. Whoever's listening, let me backtrack just a hair. Usually among spouses, what we find is that there's a division of labor, if you will. There's somebody that inherently likes this stuff better than the other spouse, and they kind of take it on, if you will. And you're probably listening because the other spouse wouldn't be listening to retire with style, if you will. But these are one of these things that you'd be doing yourself a service to have a transition in place. Because effectively, again, it doesn't become a problem until it is. And if it's been a division of labor, and we see this at our firm, you'd be surprised how many times someone comes in cold, not knowing what was happening. And even though it's not a main interest or whatever, there should be some just conversations that take place around, how things are, where things are, et cetera, et cetera. It makes a huge, huge difference from maybe providing some on-ramping with that death of a spouse issue. We've seen this. We've seen someone do it really well. We've seen folks do it very poorly. And it's a larger issue than, by the way, you got to worry about death of a spouse. It's something that, you don't want like 30 years worth of work go up in flames in 6 months because a transition wasn't properly thought out. I just wanted to put that my public service announcement, if you will.
Providing instructions, written instructions, because even just something as simple as if you have a life insurance policy, but if no one in your family knows about it or knows how to find it, it's kind of meaningless, and you've paid all those premiums and they may never have the opportunity to realize the benefit they could receive. So you do need to document these types of issues and make sure your family is prepared to handle everything that you would be handling if you're around at that point. And so
Wade, to begin to wrap things up here, from our vantage point, what we're trying to do is point out that it's not as easy. And retirement is different. You have a whole host of variables that now need to be taken into consideration. We've ended with death of a spouse, which is more of a financial planning consideration, but we started with longevity risk and how that affects income. We went into the whole fragile decade sequence risk, et cetera, and because of that human capital gap, it's not as easy to just say 100% equity, call it a day, because life happens, right? And so these are all risks that you face: spending shocks, longevity, etc. And so now the question that you want to ask yourself is, how do you take these risks off the table? Because there's many ways to take these risks off the table, or to minimize it, or to make certain accommodations. And in the upcoming episode, we're going to really drill down into how your preferences of how you want to address these risks really lead to a strategy that resonates with you. Wade?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's not everything fits into one podcast episode, but throughout the series, we'll try to do the best we can to help you find strategies to manage. Really, retirement's about the strategy is how do you meet your goals and manage the risk confronting those goals in an effective and an efficient way, in a way that resonates with you as an individual. And that's the direction we'll be headed with future episodes.
Alrighty, everyone. Thanks for listening. I'm Alex, and I'm out of here.
Take care, everyone.
Wait, do you think that's a good segue? Nah.
Work on that closing.
Yeah, right? We'll get it by the next episode. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, we're done.